Thank you. Oh, that's loud. Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. Looking forward to this after-lunch conversation on the topic resurgence of conflict across the Middle East and North Africa. We're very delighted to have a very expert panel of policy and academics and thinkers to really address that topic of regional conflict and transnational conflict in the region. So I'll introduce very briefly the speakers, and then we'll get ahead with a few questions. It'll be a conversation, and then open up the floor on the pad for everyone to submit questions. Delighted to have General Yahya Rasool, who is the spokesperson for the Iraqi Commander-in-Chief, the government of Iraq. The Right Honorable Alistair Burt, the former Minister of State for the Middle East and North Africa, Government of the United Kingdom. Dr. Sanam Vakil, the Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program, my boss. And Farah Al-Muslimi, Research Fellow at Chatham House of the Middle East and North Africa Program, as well as the co-founder of the Sanaa Center for Strategic Studies in Yemen. So before we start, the idea behind this panel, it really comes to a question that I think we're all asking, which is, we know that conflict is not confined to national borders. We know that groups, governments, entities have power that stretches across borders, economic power, political power, military power. But we also know, therefore, that you cannot confine violence and conflict to one country, and in fact, it often bleeds over, spills over into other countries, and we're seeing that certainly in the post-October 7th context, where Israel's war in Gaza is not confined to there. Strikes in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and other areas is really complicating both the nature and the dynamics of conflict, but also the solutions there. This is giving many groups and parties in the region a really difficult question on the domestic versus the transnational. And one is destabilizing the other. So we're here today to discuss what are the mechanisms, what are the dynamics of that transnational conflict, but also what can be done. Where do we start to begin to understand that this is not an Iraq conflict or Syria conflict or Palestine conflict or Israel conflict, but it's a regional conflict. And with that, I'd like to start with General Yahya Rasool. As the topic is transnational conflict, in your opinion, what is the way that the regional conflict is impacting your work in the Iraqi security sector, and what can be done to help reduce the conflict?
شكرا جزيلا السادة الوزراء المحترمين، سيدات وسادة، السلام عليكم. حقيقة الوضع بصورة عامة، الوضع بمنطقة الشرق الأوسط وضع مربك. تداعيات 7 أكتوبر، ما جرى من في هذا اليوم وبعدها الكيان الصهيوني ما قام به من عمليات قتل وإبادة بحق الشعب الفلسطيني. أكثر من 30,000 بين شهيد، بين أطفال ونساء ورجال تم إبادتهم بشكل تام. تدمير لغزة، هذا عكس حقيقة أنه هناك ردة فعل صارت باتجاه ما تقوم به إسرائيل وما يقوم به الكيان الصهيوني. لهذا نرى أنه في كل المناطق الآن، في اليمن اليوم مسيطر على مضيق هرمز وأوقفت الملاحة بشكل تام. هناك استنزاف للقوى سواء من التحالف والناتو، ورغم هذا كله هم ما مسيطرين على موضوع إيقاف عمل الحوثيين الموجودين في اليمن. نرى في لبنان أيضا هناك اتساع للرقعة وهناك عمليات استهداف. العراق أيضا كانت في بداياتها هناك عمليات استهداف جرت من الأراضي العراقية. الوضع اللي موجود به أيضا نجي على مناطق شمال شرق سوريا، هذه المناطق لا زالت الوضع بها مربك بشكل تام، لا زالت هي ليست تحت سيطرة قوات النظام السوري. هناك بها تنظيمات عديدة، تنظيم النصرة، تنظيم القاعدة، أيضا داعش متواجد ضمن هذه المناطق. سجون موجودة تضم آلاف الإرهابيين ومنعتات الإرهابيين. مخيم الهول يضم ل 60,000 من نساء ورجال وأطفال، ومعظمهم أطفال اليوم وصلوا إلى مرحلة المراهقة بعمر 15 و 13 سنة، وهم لا يملكون أي وثائق، لا يقرؤون لا يفقهون، وهناك غسيل لدماغهم ضمن مخيم الهول من قبل أمهاتهم نساء داعش. وتهيئ جيل جديد من داعش ممكن أن يكون مستقبلا قنبلة نووية إذا انفجرت ستكون 10 أضعاف ما قام به داعش. تجارب مرينا بها حقيقة، لكن أعتقد اليوم أنه الحكومة العراقية نجحت بشكل كبير بأن تعمل ضمن الدبلوماسية والحوار بإيقاف الهجمات من داخل الأراضي العراقية. الآن هذا الموضوع انتهى. العمل اللي تقوم به حقيقة الحكومة نجحت بشكل كبير ضمن الدبلوماسية والسياسة. كان دور واضح للعراق في موضوع أن تكون هناك تقريب لوجهات النظر، وأن تعيد العلاقة ما بين الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية والمملكة العربية السعودية، وهناك اليوم علاقة جيدة. أيضا العراق لا يريد أن تكون الأراضي العراقية حقيقة أن تكون ساحة لتصفية الحسابات، وفي نفس الوقت لا نريد أن تكون الأراضي العراقية منطلق لقيام بأي عمل باتجاه دولة جارة أو إقليمية. لكن لو نرجع نقيم ما يجري حقيقة أنا أقولها، المشكلة مو باللي يطلق الرصاصة الأولى إن بدأت الحرب الإقليمية، مو بالمشكلة اللي يطلق الرصاصة، المشكلة منو راح يوقف هذه الرصاصة وماذا سيجري بعد ذلك. لا ننسى الحرب الروسية الأوكرانية لحد الآن، ووضع أوروبا تعاني من موضوع الحرب الأوكرانية الروسية، الوضع الاقتصادي السياسي، هناك أمور كثيرة تجري، وهذا يجر الوضع الإقليمي والشرق الأوسط باتجاه ممكن أن تكون هناك حرب إقليمية لا قدر الله سبحانه وتعالى. لهذا نرى أن هناك حروب تكون بالإنابة، علينا أن نسيطر كيف أن نقف هذه الحروب التي تكون بالإنابة. العمل السياسي هذا مهم جدا، الحوار يحقق لك نتائج كبيرة، وهذا ما نجحت به حقيقة الحكومة العراقية. وأؤكد أنه ما يجري الآن من وضع إقليمي في الشرق الأوسط إن لم يكن مستقر ستكون نتائج وخيمة. كذلك أنا قلتها في الكثير، يمكن التقيت أنا وأستاذ منصور في لندن، كان عندي مؤتمر لمكافحة داعش والتقيت بالأستاذ منصور، قلت أنه استقرار العراق هو استقرار للشرق الأوسط. عندما يستقر العراق الشرق الأوسط يستقر كله. ولهذا أعتقد اليوم العمل المحوري اللي تقوم به الحكومة العراقية، السياسة العراقية، الدبلوماسية العراقية نجحت بشكل كبير، وهذا ما تم تأكيده. وحقيقة النجاح اللي الآن الموجود هو زيارة دولة رئيس الوزراء القائد عن قوات مسلحة إلى واشنطن، وحقق بها حقيقة تقدم ونقلة نوعية بالعلاقات ما بين العراق والولايات المتحدة. وأكدنا ونؤكد كحكومة عراقية هو المضي بإنهاء التحالف، وجود التحالف الدولي، والانتقال إلى أن تكون لدينا علاقات ثنائية مع كل الدول، سواء أمريكا أو بريطانيا أو إيطاليا أو كل دول التحالف. وأنا حقيقة كنت حضرت أكثر من لقاء مع السفراء بسبب منصبي كناطق باسم القائد العام، وأيضا كمدير الإعلام والتوجيه المعنوي في وزارة الدفاع. السفير الفرنسي عندما التقينا به مع السيد وزير الدفاع أكد وقال نحن جاهزون لأن تكون لدينا علاقات ثنائية ونوقع على معاهدات لعلاقات ثنائية مع العراق. وزيرة الدفاع الإسبانية عندما حضرت للعراق أكدت التزام إسبانيا والحكومة الإسبانية أن تذهب بأن تكون لدينا علاقات ثنائية مع العراق. حقيقة العلاقة الثنائية أفضل من التحالف. التحالف الآن بنظرنا كوجود إلى انتهى. أسس التحالف بطلب من الحكومة العراقية عندما احتلت داعش واغتصبت 40% من مساحة العراق، حققنا النصر على داعش بالتضحيات العراقية، بدماء عراقية، بمساعدة الأصدقاء من أمريكا وبريطانيا ودول، وكل الدول وقفت ويانا لأن تعي خطورة تنظيم داعش الإرهابي، إن كان هذا الامتداد مالته ممكن يمتد إلى الكثير من هذه الدول، وممكن يحقق نتائج وخسارات كبيرة لهذه الدول. لكن اليوم علينا أن نذهب بعلاقة ثنائية. العلاقة الثنائية ليست فقط في المجال الأمني أو العسكري، مجال الاقتصادي، الثقافي، في مجالات الصناعة، في كل المجالات ممكن أن نذهب بها بأن تكون لدينا علاقات ثنائية مع هذه الدول. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا جزيلا. Sana, I'm going to turn to you now. So yeah, I'll ask a question. As the general is saying, Iraq is really caught in the middle of these transnational dynamics, transnational conflict. On one side, you have the axis of resistance, groups allied to Iran across the region. On the other side, you have, Israel, the U.S., Europe, and so obviously, within the confines of that conflict, what can we know about the role of the axis of resistance across the region and where you see many of these countries going?
Thank you, Renad, and thank you to the Saleh Forum and the organizers. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's couldn't be a more timely moment to be discussing the axis of resistance and Iran's role in supporting that axis, but also to think about how to provide policy recommendations to address what is very clearly a transnational conflict, and this is a topic that we do a lot of research on at Chatham House. The axis of resistance and in Iran's role is not new, but obviously since October 7th, there has been very overt attention to the role of the Axis and its transnational capabilities that have, for the first time, been on very overt display. We are seeing the Axis cooperate formally in building capacity, sharing intelligence, operating on social media, but also, of course, there's been training, capacity building, and activities behind the scenes that are important to understand. And I think that obviously since October 7th, we are going to be learning much more about the strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and challenges if we wanted to do a SWOT analysis on the axis of resistance. We are not only the ones learning or examining, the axis of resistance is also learning and examining its strengths and weaknesses. And I'll just share with you some of my own observations of how the axis evolves or has evolved and is evolving, how we see it evolving. And that's, I think, important to understand when considering policy responses to address the axis's role in the region. More often than not, policymakers, particularly Western policymakers, are thinking that if you sever Iran's role in, and relationship with the axis of resistance, or if you apply sanctions on Iran and the axis of resistance, that will be mechanisms to address and reduce the influence of the axis of resistance. And effectively, from my understanding, the groups are much more interdependent, much more cooperative, not just as a transnational expeditionary force that we are seeing more operationalized since October 7th, but there are greater political, economic, and of course ideological linkages of the axis that need to be understood. First, let me just speak briefly about Iran's role in the axis of resistance. And how that role has changed. I think too often we approach Iran as a static actor. And if, in fact, we have just seen a few days ago, Iran behave quite differently, and that requires us to adjust our model of analysis, and that would help us anticipate how Iran might react or project its power and influence differently. But the axis of resistance from Iran's perspective is Iran's offensive defensive capacity, and built under sort of the aegis of forward defense, as it's called, meant to provide Iran strategic depth across the region, really because Iran has long seen itself as strategically isolated in the Middle East, and here I'm talking about over a number of decades. I'm not talking about a number of months or a number of years, really sort of building out this history from the time of the Iranian Revolution. And the goal of the axis of resistance that has been built not with some strategy that was devised in 1979, but rather built rather opportunistically out of regional chaos and vacuums in many countries across the Middle East, is that Iran has very gradually and opportunistically sown a network that is personal, and a network that it invests in, and it maintains relationships with, despite ups and downs, despite difficulties. And if you look at all of the relationships, be it with Hezbollah, be it with the Houthis, be it with groups in Iraq and in Syria, these are not always happy relationships. There are difficulties and twists and turns to these relationships. But the relationships endure because there are opportunities for these countries to build, and these networks to build power and influence, and build a network from the ground up. Obviously, the axis grew mainly for Iran to expand and push itself closer to its perceived threat, being Israel. And the axis has an ideological link to it that was once seen to be sectarian, but in reality it's much more about resistance and resistance to threats that are aligned across the region, the U.S., of course, and Israel. More broadly, Iran has built these relationships through wars and conflict, entering into these conflicts to preserve its relationships with Hezbollah, with Bashar al-Assad, with groups in Iraq, and with the Houthis, and then over time embedding themselves in these countries and supporting these groups to become political players, but also building economic relationships with these groups as well. Over time, and I think quite interestingly, Iran's relationship with the Axis has evolved as Iran has been increasingly sanctioned by the United States, but also the international community. A country that saw itself more strategically isolated in the Middle East has become more dependent on the Axis of resistance also for its own security, but also for its own economic connectivity. And this is quite interesting because this has made Iran more engaged in regional relationships and brought Iran out of perhaps what we could see as a long period of strategic loneliness. The Axis has also importantly evolved as Iran has used the Axis to try and maintain plausible deniability. And this is important to understand because actually Iran's role and support for the Axis has actually resulted in challenges within Iran. Iran's population is not particularly supportive of the Axis of resistance, has long been critical of the sending of resources abroad rather than using them at home. And then, of course, I think we have seen Iran be directly attacked by ISIS, also terrorist attacks inside the country. Of course, it is under maximum pressure sanctions, and particularly since October 7th, we have seen Israel, alongside international community, call out Iran and strike out Iran and try to degrade Iran's capabilities across the axis of resistance, such that since October 7th, at least 18 IRGC have been killed. Its Damascus consular facilities were also attacked. And so the edifice of plausible deniability no longer provides Iran with certain benefits. And this can explain perhaps why Iran also adjusts its role in the axis of resistance. I'm not going to belabor all of this too much because I know we're pressed for time. Just to say that when we are thinking about policy responses and consider how to approach Iran's role in the region, It's important to realize that getting rid of Iran or severing Iran's relationship from these groups on their own isn't going to resolve the problem. In reality, and a lot of our work at Chatham House is providing evidence to this, or let's say the Israeli solution of mowing the lawn on its own doesn't work. In order to try and weaken the axis of resistance as well as Iran's role in the axis, much of it requires providing support for stability, good governance, and accountability, as well as economic opportunity in all of the countries where the axis of resistance operates. And so this requires a bit of a different approach to addressing the axis. It's not just about slapping down sanctions and thinking that you're accomplishing something on its own. And I understand that in a climate of less interest in military engagement, this seems like a harder sell, but actually a longer-term strategic approach to investing in governance and accountability is very important. And a final point I would also say is addressing regional conflict in a holistic manner that also addresses the structural roots of that conflict is very important. And this speaks to the case of Palestine and the ongoing war on Gaza that we must understand. Without properly addressing the issue of Palestinian sovereignty, Palestinian self-determination, this conflict will continue to fester and provide an opportunity for groups like the Axis of Resistance, including Iran, to take advantage of the chaos and the vacuum in order to insert itself and thereby continue to promote further transnational conflict.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanam. Very clear, and picking up that discussion on policy very clearly from the Western perspective, I mean, showing that whack-a-mole and this approach of whack-a-mole really doesn't work with the Axis. Alistair, if I can turn to you, another approach that has been tried over the last few years is this idea of building a regional security architecture, primarily in the Gulf and some other countries in the region, normalizing with Israel, and then really trying to promote the idea that the solution should come from these regional players. And yet at the same time, you have countries like Jordan that aren't sure how to react sometimes when it comes to missiles being fired over Jordan territory. Which side are you on? And so it seems like you have a sort of a dichotomy in a way where there is normalization and regional integration, but then there is still these two poles. And so if we're thinking through what we should sort of propose as potential policy solutions, how do we get to that regional security infrastructure? How do we get to the Gulf states and the Arab states in the region being part of the solution?
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. And firstly, thank you to Dr. Barham, to all at the university, for providing the opportunity of all of us to be at the forum. It's much appreciated, and thank you for the invitation. The short answer to your question is you don't get to security unless you've dealt with all the underlying issues that have caused you insecurity in the first place. And to believe that you can find a structure that will somehow enable the issues to be glossed over because you've got a new security structure just won't work. Let me just unpack that and address that a little bit more widely. I take the view that October the 7th changed everything in the region. Everyone has been affected by what happened then and what happened subsequently. And I recall contacting the Foreign Office, where I no longer work, the week after, and saying the atrocious attack on Israel on October the 7th must not be compounded by a further crisis in Gaza due to the likely nature of the Israeli reprisals. And that, of course, is what we have seen. One of the agonies is that not too long before, there was a glimpse of another Middle East that you were referring to. The processes that a number of states were taking to deal with underlying causes and difficulties, and people reaching out to each other. When Jake Sullivan made his ill-timed remarks about the region not having been in such a state of ease for a couple of decades, he wasn't wrong at the time he said it, and he had enough to look back on. But of course, things changed dramatically immediately after. But the point is this: Saudi Arabia talking to Iran, brokered a lot by the patient work in Baghdad done in order to make that happen. The UAE reaching out to Iran. And then the various efforts made with Israel through the Abraham Accords and other things. There was a glimpse of a Middle East that people wanted to see without the conflict, with economic development, with opportunities, the opportunities for good governance and prosperity that Sanam has just referred to as the basis for security amongst peoples that's universal. And then it was all dashed on October the 7th, but it was dashed also by the marginalization of the Palestinian issue. The belief that if there is to be a new Middle East, somehow it can be done without the issue at the fulcrum, at the center of the region, somehow being left aside. I never believed it could, and evidence would suggest that that's the case. So in order to create what we're looking for, we have to acknowledge that that issue has now come full center. Again, as Sanam has said, unless this is dealt with, then the opportunity is going to be there for it to be used opportunistically by anyone for their own purposes. But then that marginalizes the pain and the injustice of the Palestinian people over so long. I also take the point that if security is to happen, this time it is the regional moment. In the past, the issues between Israel and the Palestinians have had a very strong Western element. It's been the opportunities taken to try and make sure that there was a Western component to the talks, to the peace process, etc. That was done before we'd seen the revitalization, particularly of Gulf states, and the importance that they now have in the region. That's changed over the last 20 years. If that new Middle East is to be realized, then regional states have got to take the lead because they have much to gain from all of it. All the regional states do. They should take the lead and they should be supported by those in the West who want to see this different outcome and different future. And my last point is that I think recent events prove that nothing is sequential. I think in the past there'd been an idea you can solve one after the other to get to a grand bargain. I'm not sure now that we're in that situation because I don't think that the elements of resolution of Syria, of Yemen, of the issues affecting ISIS as well as the Palestinian issue are not dealt with without being able to encompass it all together. No one is going to rebuild Gaza unless there is a political horizon that encompasses the West Bank, East Jerusalem, as well as Gaza. That is not going to happen without the engagement of all the states in the region. And finding that way forward is the best guarantee of security going forward for neighboring states. So this sort of regional security structure that we're looking to build is there, but it won't be done without dealing with the central issue. Up until now, every time efforts have been made to resolve Israel and Palestine, it's reached a point where it's got too difficult and everyone has put it to one side. Everyone, not just the West, but many states in the region. I know from my briefings how the issues slip down the agenda. It won't slip down the agenda now. Never should have done and won't. So that now is the key. That issue is right in front of us all. We all have a vested interest in no longer saying it's too difficult, using all our powers of persuasion with the protagonists themselves, as well as those who support them, to say this is the chance. Because if this is resolved now, if there is no going back to October the 6th, what there is a chance to move forward to is that different Middle East of prosperity, of good governments, of relationships and security that we can build on the back of having resolved that. We mustn't miss the chance.
Thank you, Alistair, for highlighting in particular the post-October 7th reality, the issue that the Israel-Palestine conflict can no longer be ignored, but also I think fundamentally that solutions cannot be compartmentalized to national borders, and I think that's important, that this very much requires a transnational response. We have a very patiently waiting Yemen expert with us to talk about the other side in a way. We've seen the Houthis as part of the Axis become quite active in this. A lot of people in Europe are upset that some of their products aren't being delivered on time, and we've seen impacts on international trade. From your perspective, Farah, where do you see Yemen going? Where do you see the Houthis and the Axis going? But also, how do we get to these solutions that Alistair talked about in terms of these countries really being on the front line of proposing solutions rather than not?
Sure, thank you very much, Rinad. I will switch to Arabic, mostly because I feel I will disappoint my Iraqi Arabic teachers if I don't, from elementary school, as most Yemenis was taught by Iraqis and Sudanese, but mostly Iraqis. Anyway, that being in mind, ربما ما أحاول أن أستطيع إضافته إلى ما قالوا المتحدثين الأكارم، ربما 3 نقاط بسيطة أعتقد، لأنه قد طرح الكثير من الحديث الأهم. والنقطة الأولى هو برأيي أن بقدر ما كانت احتلال العراق في 2003 هو ما سلم العراق لإيران، قناعتي أن حرب 2015 بقيادة التحالف العربي في اليمن هي ما سلم اليمن لإيران. هناك تدخلين دوليين بشكل مختلف، لكن في نهايتهم استطاعت إيران أن تحصل على فائدة ومكسب خطير، وهذا المكسب الآن هو متواجد في البحر الأحمر وعلى واحدة من أكثر المناطق اشتعالا في العالم. فمهما كانت مبررات المقدمات ومحاولة الكثيرين في اختلاف التشابه، لكن برأيي أن النتيجة واحدة. هذا الجزء الأول والمهم. والشيء الثاني، إذا ما أخذنا بعين الاعتبار أن الحرب في اليمن كالكثير من حروب المنطقة هي في مستوى منها حرب أهلية، لأننا كيمنيين فشلنا كنخبة أن نبدو إلى الأمام وأن نعمل عقد اجتماعي جديد، وهذا ما هو مسؤوليتنا. وهي في مستوى ثاني نتيجة لفشل التدخلات الإقليمية والدولية والأطر الدبلوماسية، سواء تحدثنا عن الأمم المتحدة أو عن الجامعة العربية أو عن مجلس التعاون الخليجي. هذا هو المستوى الثاني من فشل الدولة ومن فشل أشكال التدخلات الإيجابية في العالم. وبالمستوى الثالث هي أيضا حرب بالوكالة، وهذا هو الذي مختلف والآن نتشابه فيه كثيرا مع العراق، وهي مرحلة يكون فيها ازدهار للحروب بالوكالة. وبرأيي الشخصي ومن تجربة اليمني، وربما هذا ليس جديد لأي عراقي، لكن بمستويات كثيرة فالحروب بالوكالة هي أكثر دماراً من الحروب المباشرة، لأنها تعفي من المسؤوليات، ولأنها أيضاً مستوى تقوم به الآن دول غير قابلة للضبط، دول بلا مرجعيات لا قيمية ولا قانونية ولا أخلاقية ولا حتى اجتماعية أو قبلية بأي مستويات. وهذا مستوى خطير أو جديد تعيش اليمن من حرب بالوكالة الذي هو جديد بالنسبة لنا. وهذه الحروب بالوكالة ازدهرت لأسباب كثيرة، هو أن هناك دول سواء صغيرة أو كبيرة في المنطقة، واليمن ضحية لها، كبرت جماحها. ولكن أعتقد بشكل عام لدينا مشكلة في المنطقة، أن هناك 3 دول مهما اختلفت عن بعض، ولكن هذه الدول لها إدمان الطمع، وهي إسرائيل وإيران والسعودية. وإلى هذا إدمان الطمع خلق لنا مشكلة حقيقية في المنطقة بمستويات كثيرة، ولا يمكن أن نتعامل معه. انضم إلى قائمة هذه الدول مؤخرا دول كالإمارات والقطر بمستويات مختلفة وجديدة، وهي دول محاولة إسقاطها للسياسة طارئة، لكنها لا تقل دمارا بمستويات كثيرة. والنقطة ما قبل الأخيرة ربما الذي أعتقد أنها تتشابه مع العراق واليمن بشكل عام هو الأمل والقلق بنفس الوقت. الأمل هو أعتقد أن نحن في اليمن ربما نستطيع أن نبني أو يجب أن نبني على مستوى معين من مستويات التوافق التي تمت في العراق، لأن نحن في مراحل سياسية لا يوجد فيها الشرعية لأي أحد، سواء اعترف به من قبل الأمم المتحدة أو لم يعترف به. هذه الشرعيات والهيكليات هي شرعيات متهالكة ومنتهية. فهذا هو الأمل أن نبني، لأن نحن في لحظة سياسية، وهناك وهذا نادر باستثناء إسرائيل حاليا هناك شبه توافق إقليمي على إيقاف الاحتدام في اليمن، وهذه فرصة جيدة برأيي ونادرة خلال ال8 سنوات، سواء الاحتدام الإيراني السعودي أو الاحتدام السعودي الإماراتي أو الاحتدامات لكثير من الدول. هذا يجعل من المسؤولية التوافق برأيي، وإن لا أحب هذه الفكرة بشكل عام كباحث، لأنها هي فكرة قسرية ثقافيا لكنها اجتماعيا برأيي وبلحظة مرتبكة زي هذه اللحظة هي مهمة. وهو ربما الدرس الذي يمكن أن نبنيه من العراق، الخوف أو الأمل الذي لا أتمنى أن نبنيه من العراق، وهو أيضا الغزل غير العفيف مع الميليشيات بالأخير، سواء سميتها فصائل سميتها إيش، هذه ليست بوكيمنات. نحن نشاهد انهيار الدولة بمستويات خطيرة، والتطبيع مع العنف كما شاهدنا في العراق كما شاهدنا مع سوريا هو شيء لا يمكن أن يؤدي إلى أي نتيجة إيجابية. وربما ملاحظتي أو مداخلتي الأخيرة، أعرف قد مرينا من الوقت، هي تتشابه اليمن والعراق بمستويات كثيرة برأيي، أنه لكن أهمها وضوحا لا يمكن لبلاد الشام وهذا الجزء من العالم أن يستقر ما دامت العراق غير مستقرة، ولا يمكن أبدا وبتاتا لشبه الجزيرة العربية أن تستقر من دون أن تكون اليمن مستقرة. هذه الدولتين الضاربتين في التاريخ وإن كانت اليوم ضعيفة، لكننا وكثير من الدول، وهذه دعوة للأشقاء الإقليميين، بحاجة للتواضع أمامها، بحاجة للتواضع أمام تاريخه، وبحاجة مع أن مجتمعاتها مكسورة، لكن برأيي أن مدخلها سلام اليمن هو يبدأ، سلام السعودية يبدأ من اليمن، سلام الإمارات يبدأ من صنعاء وصعدة، وسلام سوريا ولبنان والأردن في الواقع يبدأ من الموصل والبصرة وبغداد. شكرا.
شكرا. Thank you. Thank you, Farah, for highlighting that it's not just conflict that's transnational, but peace is also transnational, and so the solution is a reminder to everyone to please send questions to this tablet, and I will have the opportunity to ask them. And I'll begin asking a question to General Yahya. We're talking about certain transnational actors that are active in Iraq, but not all of them are under the command and control of the Iraqi government. How does that challenge your job? How does it make it difficult when monopoly of legitimate violence or monopoly over force and the security sector is therefore incoherent, but also connected to transnational conflict?
أنا أعتقد يعني الوضع يختلف أبدا. يعني اليوم احنا عندنا منظومة دفاع وطني، نجي على قوات الحكومة الاتحادية اللي تشمل قطاعات الجيش، الشرطة، جهاز مكافحة الإرهاب، الأمن الوطني، المخابرات، كل هذه تحت منظومة الحكومة الاتحادية. ولدينا في الدستور قوات حرس الإقليم اللي هي من ضمن منظومة الدفاع الوطني العراقي، وحتى هيئة الحشد الشعبي أو قوات الحشد الشعبي صوت عليها في البرلمان، وهي مرتبطة أيضا بالقائد العام للقوات المسلحة. هسه يرجع واحد يقول لي عندكم فصائل، نعم هالفصائل موجودة، احنا ما نخبي انه ماكو فصائل، هذه الفصائل هي نتائج مثل ما قال زميلي ما حدث بالعراق بعد عام 2003، بعد سقوط النظام وتداعيات سقوط النظام، السلاح، الانفلات، كل هذا صار. وأيضا الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية تتحمل جزء كبير، والتحالف الدولي من أسقطوا النظام أنهوا، وبريمر في وقتها حل الجيش العراقي، وما اكتفى بحل الجيش العراقي وإنما حتى أملاك المؤسسة العسكرية العراقية ذهب بها إلى وزارة المالية. كيف بني الجيش؟ الجيش كيف بني؟ ما بني بشكل صحيح. أنا عام 2003 31/8/2003 كان ضابط استخبارات في أول ما سمي الآي سي دي سي، بعدين صار حرس الوطني، وثم صار الجيش العراقي. ما كان بناء بالشكل الصحيح، وعانينا بشكل كبير. أنا أعتقد بعد 2014 وتداعيات سقوط الموصل وما جرى في مدينة الموصل وسقوط 40% تحت سيطرة عصابات داعش، خلال هذه المرحلة كنا نقاتل وكنا نبني، وبنينا المؤسسة كقدرات المؤسسة العسكرية صارت أفضل وبشكل كبير خلال هذه الفترة، إلى أن تم إعلان النصر على عصابات داعش. لكن اليوم الحكومة نجحت كحكومة عراقية، نجحت من خلال الحوار، من خلال أن تكون لدينا قنوات تواصل مع الفصائل، وهذا ما تأكد وحدث بعد عمليات الاستهداف اللي صارت وإيقاف هذا الاستهداف اللي باتجاه يعني إطلاق من الأراضي العراقية تم إيقافه. هناك تهدئة، هناك التزام، وأعتقد أنه اليوم الوضع دا يذهب بوضع تحسن بشكل كبير، وهناك حقيقة رؤية بأن الحكومة دا تقوم بواجبها بشكل صحيح، وهناك علاقات جيدة الآن، والدولة كدولة مؤسسات دا تنمو بشكل كبير وتحقق نتائج كبيرة. اليوم العراق بال2024 مو العراق بال2014، العراق بال2018 مو اليوم احنا مثل بال2024، اختلف، هناك اختلاف كبير على مستويات كثيرة. كثير من هذه المستويات صار بها اختلاف على مستوى السياسة، هناك العلاقات بين الكتل السياسية والاحترام وموضوع الانتخابات وما شابه ذلك، هناك الشفافية، هناك وزارات، هناك عمل مؤسسات للدولة، هناك انصياع لأمر الرئيس مجلس الوزراء والقائد العام للقوات المسلحة. وهذا يؤكد على أن الدولة تخطي خطوات صحيحة ودقيقة ببناء دولة مؤسسات، وهذا ما نصبو إليه إن شاء الله مستقبلا. وهو حقيقة احنا كل اللي يجي هو يكمل عمل اللي قبله في الحكومة العراقية. كل الجهود مشكورة من قبل الجميع اللي عملوا على بناء السياسة العراقية، على بناء الاقتصاد، على بناء المؤسسة الأمنية والعسكرية، على بناء مؤسسات الدولة بالشكل اللي احنا نطمح أن نوصل له. والآن الاختلاف كبير بشكل واضح. أولا الأمن بشكل كبير في العراق اليوم يختلف، هناك أمن، هناك استقرار، حتى نسبة الجريمة المنظمة قلت، هناك التزام بالقوانين. يعني خلينا نكون واقعيين، كان موضوع سياقة العجلة بدون حزام أمان، عدم التزام بإشارات المرور، غير هذا كان ما حد يقبل عليه، لأن هناك أكو انصياع، هناك أكو جدية من المواطن العراقي بالالتزام بالقوانين. هذه يعطينا رسالة أنه اليوم الحكومة، المنظومة السياسية العراقية قادرة على أن تصل بالعراق والبلد إلى بر الأمان إن شاء الله.
إن شاء الله. شكرا. Sanam, there is another question on transnational actors, and we've talked about the solution coming from some of the regional states, but there's a question on how can or how will transnational actors influence post-Gaza security dynamics. I don't know what post-Gaza means, but the dynamics there.
I mean, it's interesting to think about what the sort of opportunities and challenges there will be post-Gaza. It's hard to imagine that in this current moment, because obviously this is still very much a live conflict and a moving conflict, and clearly a transnational one that I think has the potential to very much escalate, and we're sort of living in limbo right now, waiting to see how things are going to shift. From my view, obviously a proper political settlement, as Alistair described, or let's say a transnational peace, it needs to be brought to the issue, to Palestine at the end of the day. Without it, the axis of resistance, as I mentioned already, is certainly going to take advantage of a power vacuum and structural violence and weaknesses in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, in order to build deeper tentacles. We've heard, obviously, also since October 7th, and most recently, I mean, this is not news, but it came out in the news that Iran is supplying weapons through smugglers into the West Bank. The movement and trafficking of arms and equipment continues. So without addressing the issue of, again, statehood, sovereignty, self-determination, what we don't know that Palestinians want. I think the crisis in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem will continue to breed new conflict and breed new opportunity, and allow the axis of resistance to instrumentalize that chaos for their own purposes rather than focusing. And if you think about the axis of resistance, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, some of the PMUs here, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, again, Iran itself, a country that has seen its fair share of protests. There are domestic challenges in each of these contexts. These groups are very much using the international crises as a deflection tool for what is going on at home. Addressing the root cause of conflicts in the region will sort of disempower the Axis and its ability to stoke dissent and unrest across the region, and force political players in these systems, again, to go back to the issue of accountability and governance. It is a bit of a vicious circle that, again, through a proper political solution can be broken, and over time, with investment, and again, this is the transnational component, the investment also has to be transnational. Solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if we think it can be solved in this moment, isn't just an Israeli or Palestinian issue. It has now become a regional issue, and there is a sense of regional responsibility for this conflict. Regional security has been deeply impacted through the neglect of this conflict and through the war in Gaza, of course. And if this is not addressed in a meaningful way, this circle of violence and regional instability is certainly just going to continue to percolate.
Alistair, if you can pick up on that, just based on your experiences and expertise on the issue, where do you begin work on political? Obviously, the first step is reaching a political settlement, a political solution, bringing sides together. But that question of accountability, that question of governance, which we know we should start thinking about from now, how do you begin in terms of ensuring a bit more sustainable solution, zooming in on what's next for Palestine and Gaza?
I think the first thing is to get agreement that it is only a political solution that will work. Moving states and those who thrive on conflict away from a belief that conflict is the only answer has got to be at the root of it. So many states and so many parties would talk to me about the injustices that they felt. Everybody demands the right to hit back, as if generations of hitting back have delivered what most people want, which is a stable life, prosperity, security, and freedom from fear. It doesn't. It just sets you up for the next time. So in the particular context of the Palestinian issue, being very clear with Israel that it won't get the security that it needs without the resolution involving self-determination for the Palestinians, without being very clear with the Palestinians that they have got to take that opportunity. They need to resolve issues between themselves so that there is one credible entity that speaks for Palestinians. Getting other states, Saudi Arabia has long had, of course, the API as the basis of going forward. Getting others to say this is the opportunity to make that happen. This is the basis of seeking to persuade people that this is the only feasible way forward. And the evidence would simply be, as Sanam has indicated, looking at those who can benefit from continuing conflict. I sometimes find it difficult in the UK to explain that everybody in the region doesn't necessarily want a peaceful existence. If you make money out of a war economy, if your personal fortune is based on conflict, if the patronage that you can give to others is based on conflict, you've got no particular reason to allow conflict to come to an end, providing you're not personally threatened. So you have to work on giving people the sense that resolving conflict benefits them more than continuing conflict. Now, this is not an easy process, but I was taken with a remark this morning that reminded us that at the end of very extreme outbreaks of conflict, usually there is some sort of peaceful solution put forward because people realize that they've come close to the brink. I wonder how many people in the region after last weekend worry that they've become even closer to the brink. The nuclear issue has still not been settled in relation to Iran, partly because Israel persuaded the United States to pull out of the JCPOA and open up that issue again. But when people are close to the brink, solutions that didn't seem palatable a couple of years before suddenly become palatable again. I think the region is close to the brink, and people have spoken about it. That should accelerate those who specialize in diplomacy, those who want to deliver for their own people an opportunity of peace and prosperity to get to the political solution that's necessary. So that's the way forward. Iraq has suffered so much from conflict in recent decades, and the United Kingdom knows about that all too well. And the efforts being now to resolve those conflicts, as the General was saying, talking about the opportunities being created here in Baghdad and throughout the country, because that's what people want and can depend on. It's persuading those who otherwise depend on conflict that that is a way forward and that the risks they're taking are so great that they should move back. That's what international diplomacy is all about. And if ever there was a time for it, it's now.
Thank you. I'm not sure why everyone always asks their questions with 10 minutes to go. We have 10 minutes to go, and we've had a barrage of questions. Farah, you looking at accountability and sort of this piece from another angle, you've been working on a project at Chatham House looking at civil society across the region, across the Middle East and North Africa. You've been engaging with many of these public leaders, civil society leaders. Do they play a role in the transnational peace? What is the role of civil society across the region, in Palestine and across?
It is the spreading of militias across the Middle East. That is an unfortunate truth. And because those who had the vision of 2011 were not allowed to take their countries forward, whether by will or by misplanning. That was always the case. So, of course, that only gave the chance to militias to thrive. And I think that is really the golden word, whether in Yemen or in Syria or anywhere, it's accountability. No one is being held accountable for anything. And as we say in Arabic, man amin al-aquba sa'a al-adab. Whoever who knows there will be no punishment will most certainly misbehave, whether that's a country or an organization or a child. Yeah? It is the fact of actors in this part of the world. We have a thriving level of unaccountability. And unless there is a real, in my opinion, will to face that, we're not going to go further, because anyone will come tomorrow with more weapons, with more friends, whether in the region or outside. Someone will send them guns, someone will send them weapons, and they will do the same exact thing that we have been going through for the last 30 million years. And that's why I want to double echo your point, Alistair, is the time is not the day after. Whether in Gaza or Yemen or Iraq, the time is now. This is a region of the world running out of resources, running out of leadership, running out of peace, but most importantly and most scary, running out of time. This is not a privilege we have, whether tomorrow or after tomorrow, and whether we're talking about accountability or pushing for peace process or basically asking everyone to back off. It's not your eye for my eye. This is the moment where everyone needs to back off, and some sort of a domestic leadership, even if we don't have a clear structure of accountability, we must find a way to create accountability as even a perception. Because right now, no one even blushes, even when they look at the mirror. Because if our leaders in the Middle East look in the mirror, they would stop doing at least half what they're doing every morning. But no one is even accountable in their own eyes. And I think that's scary. Even if we don't have structures, we don't have rules at the moment, we don't have a strong judicial system, and we don't have much of anything else, but at least we still have the concept of عيب. This is wrong. And I think that must be activated in a way, even if there is no legal structure for it. Because again, the problem right now, I believe in the region, is everyone feels they can do whatever they want and get away with it. And that's something no one can afford, whether in this part of the world or anywhere else.
Thank you for highlighting the point that oftentimes those hard decisions are put to the future. Let's just reach a deal, and accountability will somehow come at some point. And I think Iraq 20 years is the example of why accountability needs to be had from the beginning. And these states of impunity that have resulted are a problem. We have just a few minutes left, and I think I've been told 5 minutes left. The next question, or I'd say the final question to the General, Yahya, in your view, what is the role of that international diplomacy and peace-building efforts can play in resolving conflicts in Iraq and the region? So what is the better way for international actors to support some of this peace-building?
أكيد يعني موضوع بناء القدرات مهم جدا. شوف احنا جربنا هاي التجربة حقيقة بمعارك التحرير. بالموصل الموصل كانت تضم بحدود 1 إلى 3 مليون نسمة. شلون علينا انه نحرر الموصل بدون ان تكون بها خسائر بأرواح المدنيين. فكانت هذه العلاقة ما بيننا وما بين المواطن نجحنا من خلالها بأن نكسب المواطن وأن نميز ما بين داعش وما بين المواطن، وبعد فتح ممرات آمنة ومراكز إيواء إلى أن كملنا ثم بدأنا بعودتهم إلى مناطقهم. علي أعتقد اليوم بناء القدرات تحتاج إلى أن تكون هناك منظمات مجتمع مدني أيضا جيدة وقادرة على كسب المواطن والسهام بموضوع بناء القدرات. القدرات العسكرية تختلف عن القدرات المدنية. أيضا أنت يجب أن يكون عندك أمان جيد، يكون عندك قوات مسلحة جيدة متمكنة، تمتلك أسلحة، تمتلك معدات حتى تدافع عن العراق وعن سيادة العراق وتدافع عن المواطن العراقي. فلهذا أعتقد أنه المرحلة القادمة هي بناء الإنسان، أنه تنجح ببناء إنسان، وخاصة تعتمد على الشباب. ممكن أكو بعض الأعمار فترة معينة وتنتهي هذه الأعمار توصل إلى مرحلة معينة، علينا نستفاد من هذه الخبرات بصقلها ضمن الشباب والاستمرار ببناء قيادات مدنية جيدة على مستوى السياسي، على مستوى الاقتصادي، على كافة المستويات حتى الثقافية، حتى تنجح بأن يكون عندك قادة المستقبل قادرين على إدارة الدولة وقادرين على إدارة مؤسسات هذه الدولة. فالخبرة مع الشباب وهذه القدرات موجودة. وحقيقة أنا خلال الكثير من اللقاءات اللي يعني حضرناها وشفناها نمتلك عقول وقدرات شبابية عراقية كبيرة جدا، لكن تحتاج أن يكون هناك اهتمام بها سواء من قبل الدولة أو مثل ما قلت لك من قبل إنشاء منظمات مجتمع مدني قادرة على صقل هذه المهام والوصول إلى أن تكون لدينا ليدرشيب أو قيادات مدنية جيدة في مجالات عديدة للسهم ببناء المجتمع وبناء الدولة.
Thank you. I think it's clear. I wanted to thank the speakers, but it's clear that these discussions need to be happening now. And I want to thank the speakers for raising really important points on how we get past the current transnational conflict and start looking at transnational solutions for Iraq and the region and Palestine, of course, where it would begin. I want to thank AUIS and IRIS and Dr. Barham for the support. As Chatham House, it's an honor to be partnering on this very important initiative, and we hope that the discussions will continue for the next day and for the next years ahead. Thank you very much again, everyone.